Hey guys, Mr. Yaisley here. So we are on to lesson number 15, which is going to deal all about when A is negative to start off the problem and how do we deal with that. Now, in terms of the process, we're still going to go through the 7 steps of the AC method. So let's take a look at example A and I'll show you how we deal with when A is a negative. So example A says negative 4x squared minus 8x plus 5. Well, step 1 is to check for a greatest common factor. Well, I see that 5 is in there, which is a prime number, meaning only 1 and 5 go into it, and 5 does not go into 4, so there's no greatest common factor for a number. X is only in 2 of the 3 terms, so it can't be a part of the greatest common factor. Now, here's where when A is negative, that comes into play. Because as we learned about before, when you have a negative on your lead term, right, your lead term has a negative, we factor that out. And so when A is negative to begin a problem, the first thing we do is we factor out a greatest common factor with a negative. Well, you may be saying, well, we didn't find a greatest common factor other than 1. Well, that's okay. We're still going to pull the negative out as a part of the greatest common factor. Because remember, as we've said, we're looking for a number other than 1. Well, negative 1 is not 1. So we're going to factor out a negative 1 to begin this problem. So when I factor out a negative 1, right, what does that leave me with? All right. Well, what did I multiply negative 1 by to get to negative 4? Well, that would be a positive 4. What about this x squared? Well, that comes down as it normally would. Well, what did I multiply negative 1 by to get to negative 8? Well, that would be a positive 8, and then we bring the x down. And then what did I multiply negative 1 by to get to positive 5? Well, negative 1 times negative 5 equals positive 5. So you may have noticed now that you're looking at that, well, that didn't really change the terms that we did except for their signs. And that's exactly true, and that should happen every single time. When our lead term for A is negative, if we can't factor out any number other than 1, we just factor out the negative 1, and that just changes the sign of every term, and then what's inside parentheses is going to look much the same, except for the signs are going to be different in front of them from where we started. And then from here, it's just like what we learned about back in lesson number 12. We're going to continue to bring that negative 1 down all the way through, and we're going to go through the rest of the AC method. So now we're on to step 2, which is to multiply A times C. Well, A in this case is always still in front of the x squared, so it is the 4 here. C is the last term with its sign, so that is negative 5. So 4 times negative 5 is what we're going to do. So 4 times negative 5, which is negative 20. So then we move on to our next step, which is to step 3, list out the factor pairs. Well, again, just like we talked about in the last lesson, we're not going to worry about the negative, all right? We're just going to list out factor pairs of 20. So 1 times 20, 2 times 10, 3 doesn't go in, and then 4 times 5, 5's on the list. So there's our complete factor pairs of 20. So now we're on to step 4, which is to figure out which of those factor pairs equals B. Well, B in this case is a positive 8. Well, which can add together to make positive 8? Well, again, remembering because this was negative, one of the terms is going to be, or one of the factors in the factor pair is going to be negative and one's going to be positive. Well, I see that if I make 2 a negative and 10 a positive, negative 2 times 10 equals negative 20, but negative 2 plus 10 equals positive 8. So there is what I'm going to use. So now we need to go into step 5, which is to rewrite the polynomial by splitting the B term. So the first thing we're going to do is bring our greatest common factor of negative 1 down. Then we are going to switch, like we learned about in lesson number 12, to those brackets because of the grouping that happens later on. Bring down our first term, 4x squared. Split our B term of positive 8x into negative 2x and positive 10x. And then bring down our last term of negative 5, end of my brackets. Well, now step 6 is to group the terms up. So I'm going to group 4x squared minus 2x, and then group positive 10x and negative 5. Again, remembering to include the sign that was in front of the third term. And then factor out the greatest common factor of each grouping. So again, I'm going to rewrite. So bring down my negative 1, bring down the bracket. Well, what is the greatest common factor of 4x squared minus 2x? Well, I know that 4 and 2 have a greatest common factor of 2. And then x squared and x have a greatest common factor of x. So 2x is my greatest common factor. Well, again, working backwards, what did I multiply 2 by to get to 4? Well, that would be 2. What did I multiply x by to get to x squared? Well, that would be x. Then what did I multiply 2x by to get to negative 2x? Well, the only way I could go from a positive version to a negative version is to multiply it by negative 1. So there is my greatest, or what's left over. So then greatest common factor of positive 10x minus 5. Well, no x's on both terms, but I see they're both multiple of 5. So 5 is my greatest common factor. My lead term is positive, so bring down the positive as a part of the greatest common factor. Then what did we multiply positive 5 by to get to positive 10x? Well, positive 5 times positive 2 equals positive 10. Bring down the x. And then what did I multiply positive 5 by to get to negative 5? Well, again, positive 5 times negative 1 equals negative 5. So there's the end of that parenthesis and the bracket. Now, if we did this correctly, we should have the same things in parentheses, which we do, 2x minus 1. So now we need to bring down the greatest common factor of negative 1. There's our first number. Our second thing we put is the first parenthesis, which is 2x minus 1. And then our second parenthesis is what's left over, which is 2x plus 5. And there is our answer. So again, this really isn't much different than what we did in lesson number 12. The only difference is our greatest common factor isn't some number, it's just a negative 1. So we're factoring out that negative so that we have all positive lead terms inside the parentheses. All right, well, let's move on to example B here and then work it out. So example B, I've got negative 2y squared minus 5y minus 3. Well, do I have any greatest common factor? That's my starting point. Well, no y's on all three terms. 2 has only factors of 1 and 2 does not go evenly into 5, so already I know no greatest common factor. But my lead term does have this negative right here. So that means that I'm going to pull out a negative 1. So I'm going to rewrite this negative 1 out front, parentheses. As we talked about earlier, that really doesn't change the terms, it just changes the sign in front of it. So negative 1 times positive 2y squared equals negative 2y squared. Negative 1 times positive 5y equals negative 5y, and negative 1 times positive 3 equals negative 3. So there we go, we factored out our negative 1. So now our next step is to multiply a times c. Well, again, a, when we look at it, is a 2 because it's in front of the squared term. Then we've got positive 3 for my c because it includes the sign in front of it. So what we're multiplying is 2 times positive 3. Well, 2 times 3 is 6. So move on to step 3, which is to figure out the factor pairs. Well, factor pairs of 6 are 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. Then our goal in step 4 is which of those factor pairs can equal b, and our b is positive 5. Well, I know that 2 plus 3 equals 5. And so there we go. We didn't have any negatives to worry about, and that was the nice thing when we factored out the negative 1. It simplified everything to positive numbers, so it made our life a little bit easier. And so there we go. Now we're on to step 5, which is to rewrite the polynomial by splitting the b term. So first thing I do, bring down my greatest common factor, so negative 1. I'm going to switch to the brackets. Bring down the lead term in the polynomial, which is 2y squared. Split my positive 5y into two terms, which are positive 2y and positive 3y. And then bring down my last term of positive 3, and that's the end of my brackets. Well, step 6, now we're going to group up and factor out the greatest common factor of each grouping. So I'm grouping up first two terms and second two terms, including the sign in front of that third term. And now I'm going to rewrite factoring out the greatest common factor. So first step, bring down our greatest common factor of -1 here, then my bracket. Well, greatest common factor of 2y squared plus 2y, well, they both have 2, so I know 2 is a part of it. Greatest common factor of y squared and y is just y. So what did I multiply 2y by to get to 2y squared? Well, that would just be y, because 2 times 1 equals 2, and y times y equals y squared. And what did I multiply 2y by to get at positive 2y? Well, that's just multiplying by 1, so positive 1. Then greatest common factor of 3y plus 3. Well, 3 and 3 are the greatest common factor. That's what they have in common. No y's in common. And because the lead term was positive, this is a positive 3. Well, what did I multiply positive 3 by to get to positive 3y? Well, that would be y. What did I multiply positive 3 by to get to positive 3? Well, that would be positive 1. End of parentheses into my bracket. Again, if we did this correctly, we should have the same thing in parentheses, which we do. So now bring down my greatest common factor of -1. First parenthesis is y plus 1. Second parenthesis is what's left over, which is 2y plus 3. Now again, it really doesn't matter which parenthesis is first or second, but the -1 does need to be out in front of all of that. All right, well, I'd encourage you to try example C on your own and then check your answer with mine. So example C, we've got -5m squared plus 6m minus 1. Well, greatest common factor, not an m on every term, so it can't be that. One of my terms is 1, so I know right away there's nothing greater than the number 1. But again, I notice that my lead term has a negative, so I need to factor out a -1. So, broke my pencil, there we go. -1 is my greatest common factor. What did I multiply -1 by to get to -5m squared? Well, remember, that's just going to switch every sign on these. So -5m squared becomes positive 5m squared. Positive 6m becomes -6m. And -1 becomes positive 1. And there we go. We factored out the greatest common factor of -1. So step 2, multiply a times c. Well, a again is in front of our squared term, which is 5, and c is the last term, so 5 times positive 1 is positive 5. Well, what's factor pairs of 5? That's step 3. Well, that's just 1 and 5, so there's only one factor pair, so that should make our life easier, right? Well, now we need to figure out how do we make that factor pair equal b, which in this case is -6. Well, again, remembering those rules that if we multiply a negative times a negative, we can end up with a positive, but when we combine together, we can end up with a negative. So if I make both 1 negative and 5 negative, -1 times -5 equals positive 5, but -1 minus 5 equals -6. So there is what we're going to use. So now we need to move on to step 5, which is to rewrite the polynomial, splitting up the b term. So first thing I'm going to do, bring down my -1, switch to my brackets. Lead term stays the same, so 5m squared. Split my b term of -6m into -1m minus 5m. And then bring down my last term, which is positive 1. Now, a lot of questions I get is, well, I see that these 5s could have something in common, so I could switch them. Is that possible? Yeah, you could. Again, it doesn't really matter which term here comes first or second. It's however you want to do it. But I'm going to moving this way just to show you what it looks like. So step 6, now we're going to group them up. So group our greatest common factor here, or our first 2 terms, then our second 2 terms, including the sign in front of that third term. That's important. So then now we're going to rewrite our polynomial or by factoring out the greatest common factor. So bring down our -1, bring down brackets. Then what's the greatest common factor of 5m squared minus 1m? Well, 1 and 5 only have 1 in common, but they both have m, so I'm going to factor out an m. Well, what did I multiply m by to get to 5m squared? Well, that would be 5m. What did I multiply m by to get to -1m? Well, that would be -1. So then I move on to the second grouping, negative 5m plus 1. What's the greatest common factor? Well, 5 and 1 don't have anything in common other than 1, and they don't both have m's, so I can't really bring anything out, can I? Well, again, remember, because our lead term is negative, we need to factor that out. So what we can factor out is negative 1. Well, now, okay, what did I multiply negative 1 by to get to negative 5m? Well, again, that's just going to switch these signs. So positive 5m times negative 1 equals negative 5m. And negative 1 times negative 1 equals positive 1. Well, if that's the case, then I should have the same thing in parentheses, which I do, 5m minus 1 and 5m minus 1. So that means that I've done this correctly. So first thing we do, bring down our greatest common factor at the beginning of negative 1. Our first parenthesis is the 5m minus 1. Our second parenthesis is what's left over, which is m minus 1. All right, and that is our answer. So if you have any additional questions, please let me know. But you should have from here what you need to continue starting on Chapter 6, Worksheet number 5.